I just love preaching from the book of Genesis because it is so down to earth, so human, so like us, so filled with the stresses of family and community life. The entire book of Genesis is concerned with explaining how the Israelites got to be a people and how it happened by God's undeserved favor. God uses people of dubious character to form a people who would one day be enslaved as a result of mass global migrations. The Genesis narrative centers around one particular family. They are always feuding and struggling and plotting internally against one another. This has gone on since Abraham and Sarah. It happened with Isaac and Rebekah, the twins Jacob and Esau, and Jacob's two competing wives to see who could get more kids. And now Jacob's sons, the older sons, resent the youngest, Joseph, who, as a late surprise to the family, is clearly Daddy's favorite. Joseph is a tattletale, having already ratted out his brothers a couple of times. He has this dream about his father and brothers bowing down to him. Their father, on top of all this, gifts Joseph with a coat of long sleeves, big sleeves. I know, we all heard growing up that it was a coat of many colors. But in the translation of the Hebrew is a coat with big sleeves. It's a sign of status, of honor, of importance. So Joseph became a threat to the family order. The older brothers had the power dynamics all worked out. And in that culture, the oldest got everything, and the youngest was never treated like a spoiled rich kid, as was Joseph. And today, as our story opens, the brothers are away from home, taking care of sheep, while Joseph lounges around home, doing what? Playing video games or whatever he was doing. And his father sends Joseph once again to spy on them, because just recently they had gotten into some trouble in town. They're working in the hot sun, and here comes this little smart aleck youngest brother, obviously there to spy on them for their father. And again, it happens. We can just imagine their resentment boiling over at the mere sight of him. Their fears about losing their inheritance, fears of not being loved by their father, the fear of being cast aside, the fear of not being trusted, the fear of being reported once again in a bad way. Fear took hold of them. Karl Barth, one of the dominant theologians of the 20th century, wrote that fear is the anticipation of a supposedly certain defeat. And yes, fear is what is driving Joseph's brothers. They fear him for his dream of ruling over them. They fear him because he is Jacob's favorite. They fear because he'll go tell Daddy what they're doing wrong. As Barth said, we learn to fear that which we imagine will defeat us. And so to protect ourselves, we make life an exercise in walling ourselves off from possible threats to our security. Since the beginning, we have feared the dark. Annie Dillard writes about a strange light that swept across her bedroom wall, night after night, hour after hour. At 5 years of age, she was afraid to go to bed at night, because as soon as she did and turned out the light, this being would come into her room. She couldn't see it, but the evidence was there, this light. And then one night she figured out that the windshields of passing cars were reflecting the street lights from outside. Fear. It can almost take you over. Fear of the loss of relationships keeps us from intimacy. Fear of perceived certain defeat in family relationships keeps us from confronting a parent or comforting a child or even speaking our heart. The fear of failing at a job paralyzes us so that we do fail. Fears can come to define us and hold us hostage. It could be an abusive father or spouse. The recipient of abuse, you see, lives with two fears: fear of physical harm and fear of being blamed for it all. Our world seems to be ordered by power and powerlessness, by the bullies and the bullied. So it must have been for Matthew Shepard in the wilderness of Wyoming. Surely it was like that for James Byrd as he was dragged to his death, or for George Floyd, or for spouses who believe they deserve the beating they regularly receive. So it must be for children waiting to be assaulted by an adult caretaker. Fear limits us. Fear brings out the worst in us. It brings out hatred and fear. We seek, when we are afraid, we seek to maintain the status quo because it's what we know. We want to protect ourselves from the threat of change. And so fear can even become communal, directing our anxieties in hatred into assumptions based on race, resulting in exclusion, abuse, violence, even extermination. C.S. Lewis wrote that fear is the basis of all hatred. It's how a frightened man compensates for his fear. Lewis said the more he fears, the more that man will hate. Fear can distort an entire community. It lurks beneath the pretense of privilege and power. It hides behind prejudice, preying upon the most vulnerable. And this fear comes dressed up to make it sound respectable, almost righteous, as though God is somehow asking us to maintain our domination, as though God expects us to strengthen our hold on the present order. And so we scapegoat, designating someone else or some other group as a repository for our own weaknesses, for our fears, so that we can maintain an illusion of strength. We exclude anything that blurs our boundaries, disturbs our identities, or disturbs our social maps. We perceive those who are different, who are not of our tribe, as out of place, like dirt that needs to be swept away in order to return a sense of propriety to our world. This is what fear does to us. This is how fear distorts the identity of our community. Fear erodes everyone's safety. And Joseph's brothers were harboring a hatred born of the fear that Joseph was a threat to their position in Jacob's family. Their fear of Joseph led them to sell him down the river. They ditched him because of his dream. But there's a problem. It wasn't just Joseph's dream. It was God's dream. And that's why they couldn't kill the dream. People often react to initiatives begun in the mind of God out of the fear of change or fear of whatever. Dreams often result in violence to suppress the dream. Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed of equality and brotherhood, and in response, white folk were scared to death of the idea that we would live and dwell and work beside one another in peace and harmony. And so they killed King. But his dream continued with more force than ever. The same fear resulted in John Lewis almost being beaten to death in Selma. But King's dream brought huge gains for the descendants of slaves and the victims of Jim Crow. Dreams can be planted by God, and too often our response is fear and violence. Today, we struggle with an unfounded fear of black men. We continue to allow police to mistreat and terrorize communities of color. And so, yes, we need to affirm Black Lives Matter, because saying all lives matter doesn't mean anything until we know that Black lives matter. We fear facing the truth about the social systems that perpetuate discrimination, that keep people of color down. It's all rooted in fear. People fear the results of allowing African American citizens equal access to education and jobs, equal access to protection under the law, equal access to the voting place. The conventional world is suspicious of dreamers because they dream of new realities and we don't like change. Resistance to God's dreams can be ugly, even murderous. Humanity tends to not like change, but God plants dreams. Let's dream of being a society that puts aside its irrational fears so that we can act responsibly to solve our problems, so that we can responsibly address the need to stop the spread of COVID. Let's set aside our fears so that we can work together to eliminate systemic racism. Let's work to make that dream reality and accomplish great things together with God's help. Dream big, live big, driven not by fear, but by love. Amen.